Okay, so I'm Viktor Witkowski. I directed Rutland. And that's also my first full feature film that I did. I did a few other shorter films. So speaking of short films, I did several short films before that. And most of these films are somewhere in between art film and documentary film, or experimental film and documentary film. So I'm not trying to be a classic documentary filmmaker, mainly because my background is in the visual arts. I'm mainly a painter. And I came to film just about 3 years ago. And the reason that I started filming Rutland had to do with this particular film that I pulled up here on the screen. So that's not a false film, the wrong film, but it's actually how things started for me. So Refuge is set in Germany, and I filmed it in 2016. And actually that one is, you can see the whole short film on Vimeo, on my Vimeo page. It's 20 minutes long. And basically when I was talking to my parents on the phone, so my parents live in Germany still. I grew up in Germany, and I was born in Poland. So I was talking to my parents, and they mentioned in 2015 how there are these Syrians who showed up and who are in the small town where I grew up in Germany. And so I got curious, and I started looking more into and getting more involved with the Syrian civil war and the effects it had, the impact it had on the people, on the country, and then of course the so-called refugee crisis that then started developing mainly in October 2015, which is exactly when Russia joined the campaign and started air raids. And that's what multiplied the amount of refugees, because suddenly you were talking about serious fighter jet planes who were bombing civilians. And so in Germany, there were about roughly 1 million refugees that arrived between October 2015 and the summer of 2016. And that also has never really happened in German history before, that you had this large amount of people in such a short period of time. And it made an impact, made a visible impact on communities across Germany, small towns, big towns, everything in between. And so my parents were talking about these refugees that were set up in my former elementary school. And so I decided that it might be a good idea for me to switch my medium, to go away from painting and go toward a new medium, in this case film making or film, and document what I saw, what I would be seeing in Germany. And so I went over to Germany in April of 2016, and I started filming in different places, so Berlin mainly, and then Bremen. Bremen, it's kind of like in the northwest of Germany. It's also a sizable big city. And then in some small communities in between, where I grew up, and then some other towns around Bremen. And basically I was trying to document what I was seeing on the ground, and I tried to meet with refugees, so with Syrians mainly, but also some Iraqis and Afghanis who were coming in at the same time. And I talked to Germans who were helping these people, social workers, volunteers, psychologists, all kinds of nonprofit organizations that were all involved in trying to help these people to make a new life for themselves. And so while I was in Germany and filming this, I heard about Chris Luras, who was then still the mayor, talking about this initiative that he wanted to implement in Rutland. And that was something that really just happened, I don't know, it must have been May 2016 when I saw it, and I just started following the news a little bit here, so the Upper Valley News, the Rutland Herald, and I thought to myself, I made a note, and I thought, that might be a good idea to do if I get back to the States, because what I'm doing right now with Refuge, with this particular project, it's more for a European and German audience, and I would like to do something for an American audience. that would be based also around the area where I live now. And the way that things then developed were that I came back in the summer of 2016, and a colleague of mine had already reached out to Christopher Louris, a colleague from Dartmouth. And she basically offered, whatever you need down the road, if it's donations, any kind of help, we're here, we're going to help you if you need anything. And I met Christopher Louris at a dinner that was happening in Hanover, and introduced myself, and we talked, and I said, I would be interested in coming down there, or actually driving up and talking to you and just hearing a little bit more about what you're trying to do, talk to some people who are involved, and take it from there. So in the beginning, the idea was to make a film that was a counterpoint to Refuge. So Refuge focuses on the Germans who are helping refugees to resettle, but also it's focusing on the refugees themselves. And my idea was, okay, why not apply something similar to when I come here? I'm going to focus on the people who are helping and working to make this happen, so Rutland welcomes in particular. And on the other hand, I'm going to focus on the new Americans, the refugees who are going to come here and resettle. And things just didn't come together that way, as you all know. And it actually was a bit of a struggle to trying to adjust. Because what started becoming, what I started to realize was with the upcoming election, that things were probably not going the way that we were hoping they would go. And the people involved in Rutland Welcomes, I think, also had a pretty good sense that, it might not really come together in the way that they had expected and prepared for. And I wasn't quite sure, of course, how the election would go. I mean, nobody really knew. Maybe some people knew, I don't know. But I just decided I'm going to go with it for now. I'm going to keep coming down here, talking to people, and I'll just see what happens, and I'll let the circumstances dictate how I'm going to proceed with this documentary. So at that point, I knew that I probably would spend more time with this, and it wouldn't be a short project like the previous one in Germany, where I spent 3 months in Germany. I came back, I edited the material, and then it was done. So this would probably be something that would last a longer time. So before I just continue, I also wanted to let you know, if you have any questions at any point, please interrupt me and just ask a question or a comment. It doesn't have to be a question. Any comment, any feedback would be great. So I would prefer if this was more of a conversation than me presenting, but of course I'm happy to just go on and present.
I'm really interested in going from being a painter to being a filmmaker. that's like a fascinating, wow. How does that happen?
I mean, I've always been interested in film, and film has always been part of my education too. When I was studying art back in art school in Germany, we didn't have a curriculum that was fixed, like drawing 1, 2, and 3, painting 1, 2, and 3. We didn't have any of these classes. It was all you were basically people were asking you to try out different media and try out different things, and you were encouraged to experiment a lot. So one of the things that I did was video editing early on. So that was 2000, I think, with whatever Adobe Premiere version was available then. And when I would go to see exhibitions, so we're talking contemporary art exhibitions, video art was always on top of my list. It was something that I was paying attention to. And then, of course, film, too. I mean, filmmaking has always been a source of inspiration and something that I have been thinking about a lot. I think that one of probably the single biggest impacts on painting back in like the early 2000s was a film by Terrence Malick. So Terrence Malick is definitely a source for me that I keep going back to when it comes to, having this approach that's based in observation and letting things happen and develop in front of the camera without you trying to intervene too much, and this kind of poetic approach to filmmaking as well. And so when his Thin Red Line came out, I think it was 1998, that was something that definitely and directly influenced and made an impact on paintings that I was doing. So I did a series of paintings later on that were small landscape paintings of, let me just pull this up. They're called war landscapes. And just to show you something like this one. So they're basically paintings of war happening, but they're framed as landscapes, as something atmospheric, as something beautiful, but also fearful, something that is horrific in a way, but also terrific. And when you watch The Thin Red Line by Terrence Malick, there are a lot of shots of landscape, nature, and then it being destroyed by war, by how men treat the landscape, the land, and how they treat each other. So that's something that I always keep thinking about and something I keep going back to. And when I am out with the camera, I'm trying to think about how to compose images, of course. But I think landscape is something that keeps coming back and coming up in all of the films that I'm dealing with. And going back to Rutland, I mean, when I came to Rutland first, I was very much reminded of the landscape in Poland where I grew up, which is mountainous, not giant mountains, but kind of like here, mid-range mountains, and it's also a ski resort area like Killington is, for instance. And I was immediately reminded of where I was growing up as a child in Poland. And I knew that I wanted to bring that into making the film Rutland. I wanted to approach it through, this beautiful fall that you get here, the beautiful fall colors, and then this kind of disturbing element that I would always see when I was driving from Norwich up to Rutland. Off the 4, this little house with the 3 flags, Don't Tread on Me, the American flag, and then the Confederate battle flag. And that to me was just the symbol of what was going on at that point. I didn't bring my camera today. I was planning on bringing the camera that I have been using until now, which is basically the cheapest thing I could buy and afford. When I bought it, it's like a $250 Canon handheld. And I do like it. I mean, it comes with a lot of limitations, and I'm not happy about certain things that happen when you edit. And I'm about to upgrade. But I do like the aesthetic, and I like that you can insert yourself into situations where you can immediately create a more intimate access to the situation of the person you're engaging with. And that's something that was important to me from the start. That is also why I don't work with a team. It's not that I'm a control freak who wants to be in charge of everything. It's about the access. It's about the degree of intimacy that you get with the subject, the person you're talking to. There's a little camera with a little microphone. It's not a team behind you. So they're much more comfortable, much faster. And that was really crucial to me. I went into this project with a set idea that then had to change because the situation was changing on the ground really, really quickly, and I had to adapt. And one of the things that happened was that I met with Bill Ramage, the artist from Rutland. And we were talking because he put up an exhibition that included works by refugees or Syrians living in exile all across Europe mainly. And they sent him their digital files, their work. and he printed them out, mounted them in the former bank building, and put up a show. So it was a show by Syrians in exile who were making art about their status, their situation, their identity, their role. And I thought it was fascinating, so I wanted to meet with Bill and talk to him. And while we were talking, he mentioned in passing this whole other history of Vermont that I didn't know. The hippies coming to Vermont and how there was this reaction to it. I just thought, really, was it, was it really like that? And so I got in touch with the Vermont Historical Society, and it turns out that they had done a exhibition on the hippie scare in Vermont, on the hippie invasion a while ago, and they have really great archives. And so they were, or they are, in possession of all these letters that were written to then Governor Davis, who was a Republican governor. And it was really fascinating to go through these documents. They sent me, Vermont Historical Society sent me a PDF with, I don't know how many, there must have been 24 or so. And I went through them, and it was really striking to see and read about these similarities, about, this sometimes latent racism, but often just not latent at all, but very pronounced. And how people, the funny thing was that a lot of the Vermonters were complaining about how Vermont is changing were actually from somewhere else. There were a lot of people who came from Florida to Vermont, or were mentioning, I'm going to be back in Florida, but when I'm back in Vermont in the summer, and so you kind of get a sense of, these people who are transients too. So, there's very few locals at that point, like people born and raised in Vermont. So a lot of people coming from outside and for different reasons. But I thought it was really striking to have this slice of history specific to Vermont that also relates back to, the hippies. So we're talking about people that are usually affiliated with a particular political ideology that doesn't fit with the ideology of certain other people, and how they were labeled as this invasive force that would take over and change Vermont. And to me, that's just very similar to any other conversation, not even the refugee conversation in Rutland, any other conversation about immigrants coming to Vermont or any other place, and being seen as this invasive force. So that was actually something that, of course, I had not thought about when I started this project. And thanks to Bill, I was able to pull this out and put together this really short narrative that appears early on in the film, and kind of like sets the tone about the conversation, the larger context of what's happening in 2016 during the presidential election, when, for instance, the then candidate is suggesting that we should have a Muslim ban, right? So we're trying to ban these people who are trying to come here and invade the country. So I thought it was interesting to find something in history and bring it back into the present, and reveal a part of Vermont history that not many people, myself included, knew about. And I went a little bit further, if you go a little further back in the history, because one of the things I was obviously interested in early on when I started filming Rutland was the Polish community in Rutland, and the extent to which it was crucial in building Rutland. Most of the Poles who came here around the turn of the century, so late 19th century, early 20th century, were working in the quarries. And they then started this series of strikes that became very violent too in the 1910s and 20s in particular, and got national attention. So there was this really interesting mix of historical facts and I thought aspects of Vermont and Rutland history that you could relate back to the conversation about the refugees, but also at some point I had to make a decision and decide, let's stay focused here let's not try to expand too much and look in too many different things. But I thought it was really interesting to hear about that. And also there was another piece of information that I followed up on, which talked about the Ku Klux Klan that was in Vermont. Very limited in number, but they definitely had a major rally in the 1920s in Montpelier. So it was a lot of different, moving facts. And to me, since I'm new to Vermont, all of that was really super interesting and very new. And it kind of tells you a little bit about how history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but how each country, each state has some skeleton in their closet, or several. So I used this footage, this archival footage from 1941. It is the spring of 1941 of Rutland. And obviously music is important too. So there is very specific music throughout the whole documentary where I kind of contrast styles. And I thought it was nice because I kind of have fun with the archival footage, and I split it up and do like a split screen. And there's music by this Parisian artist, actually, who I met when I was in Paris, who said that he would be happy to provide the sound for it. So it's kind of trip hop with 1941 Rutland footage. So I really had fun with that. And there's actually another music, a song later on by, she's called Sarah Maison, and she's Parisian, but with Moroccan roots. And so she also agreed to provide her song. And you basically have like winter scenes of and around Rutland. And so you have this French-Moroccan singer sing in French. And then it cuts over into the group that was meeting at the Rutland church, the UU church. Right, the Unitarian church, when they were having their Arabic lessons. And so I fused her song, her being an immigrant to France, with people in Rutland trying to learn Arabic using, it was Arab Idol that they were playing. So like, these kinds of different layers and trying to like put it together. It was a lot of fun. And in one of the earlier shots, you see a what looks like an officer standing by a Uncle Sam recruitment poster. Mm-hmm. So spring 41, men are being recruited. So the draft is in place already. And there was this really amazing footage here of people getting on the train and going to boot camp. And you'll see the teenager here, nervous, and then this officer walk toward it. So I thought it was a really nice way to kind of like also show this slice of Rutland, Vermont, where there's this preparation for war. When I was thinking about editing this and when I started putting together the structure, there were different ideas of how I want to do it. And one of the ideas was, well, let's maybe, spice it up a little bit, make it more dynamic, and tell a little bit from the end of filming and then bring something in from the beginning of filming. So like mix it up, do some nice montages. But then I realized when I was looking through the footage that I had filmed that the best way to actually tell this story, this narrative, was to be chronological. So basically this starts September 2016 and it ends in the summer, August 2018. And that's how it's structured. Basically how I met people and the things we're talking about, how things progressed here on the ground, nationwide with the election and so forth. There's a segment I filmed in New York City as well in 2017. And the reason I did that was that you get a sense that things are starting to go the wrong way. And you start feeling how people get more and more nervous and upset and doubtful. And it was this feeling and emotion that was coming up through the footage that I was filming that I didn't quite anticipate before. They just had this hard time and they were still believing that it might go the other way. So this is, what are we talking? I think this was about November, December 2016, so right around shortly after the election. And they just know that they're headed in a direction that they don't want to be in. And they also feel like all this agency that they were building up and creating, that it was being taken away from them. And one of the things that, when I had this premiere, so this film was shown publicly only one time, and that was after I had finished it, and I showed it in here in Rutland. That was back in February 2018. And, 2019, yeah. And there was one person in the audience, and the funny thing is that he was French, and he's speaking with an accent. I'm like, oh, okay, you're a fellow European too. What's the question? And so he said, why didn't you show the other side? And one of the things that you won't see in this documentary is the other side. So Rutland First, or anybody who was against the resettlement plans. And I told him, I definitely thought about it, and I contacted them, of course. I mean, that's my duty in a way. I reached out to them. I talked to them once by email, once on the phone for about 2 minutes maybe. And it was very clear that they had no interest whatsoever. And I also offered, one of the things I said, I'm not a journalist, I'm an artist, I'm trying to approach this, and I just want to hear you out. If you don't want me to bring a camera or a microphone, let's just sit down and talk. I'm happy to do that. It can be completely off the record. They still didn't want to meet. And, the other thing that I reminded the French person of in the audience was, we have had this issue in Germany for decades. So in Germany, we've had this ongoing discussion about how do we treat neo-Nazis who have always been there. They have never left. They have always been there. And now, if you follow German politics a little bit, they're kind of emboldened and strengthened. They have always been there. How do we include them in the dialogue? And in the States, you have freedom of expression. In Germany, you have freedom of expression, but you also have a clause which doesn't allow you to preach hate speech. So if anybody who clearly has an agenda, who wants to blame one group or another group, they will never get to speak up in public. Freedom of speech will not allow you to do that. And this conversation has been happening in Germany for a very long time. So when I got here, I made the decision, after having reached out to them and having kind of heard their opinions, that there would be no benefit whatsoever to have them in the documentary based on the arguments that they were saying. And, the arguments were, they will bring diseases, they will bring Sharia law. And these are things that we can talk about budgetary things, we can talk about how Rutland has its own issues, that money would be spent better otherwise. There is a range of things we can talk about. We cannot discuss accusations that have no foundation whatsoever. And so that was, for me, the way I drew the line. And I said, I tried. You don't want to. The things you're saying are not supported by the facts. It's not going to happen. And on the other hand, I also thought I wanted to focus on just the sheer goodness of people trying to make this happen. What are they doing? They're trying to help people who are fleeing war, like Chris Lewis said many times over and over. This is it. So that's all they're really doing. They're trying to help other people. And there's nothing bad about that. And if they want to do that, then I want to support them by showing other communities, other states, maybe other countries, how they're doing it. And so I wanted to focus on that drive, on that motivation. What I decided was there is some middle ground where I'm willing and happy to meet. And that just doesn't make it to make these accusations that are, again, unfounded, have no foundation whatsoever. And now we're all finding ourselves, and not just in the States, I mean, this is something that is happening all around, in Germany, in Italy, in Scandinavian countries that used to be, regarded as the beacon of democracy, post-World War II democracy. We're being confronted with people who have discovered that it's actually really easy to express a lie, to express something that is untrue, and that it will take a lot of energy for somebody to disprove that. And that makes it really hard. But I think it should make it easier for people to decide, where they stand. Am I going to support something that's truthful, or am I going to try to support something that's just completely based on facts that are untrue or completely made up? And, as a filmmaker or documentary filmmaker, you should be unbiased, and you should be open, and you should try to find a balance. But I also think that sometimes you do have to take a position. And I'm happy to stand up for this position. Also, in the end, it's not, I didn't want to drag Rutland more through this either, because at that point, I mean, the media focus was very, very strong. And I remember one of the families that had just arrived in Rutland were put on Anderson Cooper on CNN just after I had talked to the resettlement agency, and they had told me, no, we're going to protect them, you can't talk to them. And then they're on CNN, Anderson Cooper, and I just thought, this is not right. You have to allow them some space and some privacy, and you need to realize what this is about. This should be all about helping them and getting them to find their way into a normal life after having been for years in a refugee camp. You have to tone it down, basically. You have to give them some privacy and space. And so there are ways for filmmakers, for any filmmaker, for me, to, work around that and to accept a different point of view. But there is, I think, a line that each of us should also draw at some point, where you should ask yourself, am I giving a real debate, a real conversation, a platform, or am I simply fueling a discussion that really shouldn't be happening? The other part is that there's very few radical people, dedicated radical people on both sides. There's a lot of people who are just in between and who are not quite sure. And that's the biggest danger. People who could go either way, who are not sure and are afraid, maybe. When I started going through the material and editing it, that word came up a lot. I'm afraid, I'm fearful, there's fear. And even in those passages from the letters to the governor, now it's the hippies' fear again. It's definitely something that kept coming up, and it actually made sense, because when I heard it as an argument, they're just trying to, get people to be afraid, and, people are buying into it. I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to buy that reasoning, but I now definitely do. It has a lot to do with that. In Europe, it was very similar. It was so much stronger, the reaction there, in a way. I think was surprising for a lot of us, was definitely surprising for me. So in Germany, you had, like I said, about 1 million people who came within a short period of time. Some of these people, I think about the numbers now, stand at 700,000 is the official number. So 300,000 people went to other European countries because families were distributed, and so they had to find their way. But, bottom line is, it was a huge amount of people who came to Germany, but they came to Germany through other European countries. And so you had that surge in nationalism, mainly because of the refugee crisis that was caused. And I do like to remind people of why we had that refugee crisis, because the Russian Federation joined the war. They joined Assad. And it just suddenly turned into a real war. And people started dying in large numbers because of the military equipment that was being used that Assad didn't have. His army was almost at the brink of collapsing at that point in 2015. And so it was used as a weapon. The refugees were used as a weapon, clearly. And when I talked to Syrians who were in Germany, it was usually men that I approached, and because they were kind of like the main group that arrived in Germany first. And I would approach them and be like, my name is Viktor, what's your name? And most of them had this joke where they would respond saying Assad, Bashar al-Assad, and they would like crack up. And so to most of the people, to most of the Syrians, the reason why they were exiled was pretty clear. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't that you had different nations being involved there. It was very clear. It was a dictator who suppressed them and made it impossible for them to live there. And different national groups, nationalists, jumped on that in Europe. And they actually won elections with that campaign all over Europe. And so for the first time in German history, since the end of World War II, you had a far-right party in parliament. I also think one of the things that I try to tell my American friends usually is, don't be so focused on Trump, on President Trump. I agree, or disagree. I mean, sometimes I just think I don't care what he's saying today or tweeting today, but don't focus so much on this individual, because there's more to it than him. When I came to Germany from Poland, so my parents fled Poland in 1983. And so we arrived as refugees in Germany. I had my refugee stamp in my ID card, and the wall was still up, so I'm familiar with walls. And I was growing up Polish speaking in Germany, and multiple times up through the early 90s, I was hassled by neo-Nazis. And neo-Nazis then were visible because they had the boots with the white laces and the shaved head. Now they got smarter and they blend in, and you can't quite, distinguish them by their looks, but they have always been there. So what I'm trying to say is they have always been there, and sometimes they feel more encouraged than other times. And right now is a time where they feel very encouraged and emboldened. And so I also think that as much as I would like to say, I made a documentary, I tried to be as balanced, I tried to listen to both sides, I can't quite do that. I can't quite commit to that, because the consequences of that would be me being completely passive. And right now is not the time to be passive. There is a gap when you watch the documentary, and it kind of stops in March 2017, and it doesn't pick up until August 2018. So it's kind of like a year and a few months. I went back to Germany, I want to say in May 2017, and I did this other short film about these former refugees from Syria who are now museum guides in 3 museums, art museums in Berlin, giving tours to Germans and other refugees about the art collection that is there. So I did that, and I kept thinking about Rutland, and I also kept following, what was happening here. And then basically it was shut down, the program, right? And so the Muslim travel ban is pretty much still in place, in particular for the Syrians. And so I decided I need to go back over the footage and kind of see what I want to do with it. And so what I realized was basically I need a comment here. I need a comment about what has happened since. And so I got in touch with Chris Loris. And we filmed a scene in August 2018. And basically, he's looking back. And it's really nice. It's 5 minutes. It's not, I kept all of the interviews pretty short. So it's 5 minutes of him kind of going back and talking about what has happened since, how he feels about it, doing his new job. And I went to the Rutland fair that was happening because, I mean, I spent most of my life in villages and small towns. That's where I grew up. And so I knew if you want to get a sense of a place, you go to the city fair. So I went to the city fair, I did some shots there, the animals that they have, people, kids, and kind of like put in Chris slowly. So Chris' voice is coming in, and so we have an interview with him, and that's kind of it. I was doing paintings alongside when I was filming. It's in this ongoing series that's called Borderlands. This is Hunter Berryhill, who is from Rutland, who was part of the Rutland Welcomes group. And he appears in the documentary a little bit. I didn't do an interview with him for the documentary. He's reading out a poem on that stage in that movie theater, or in that theater in Rutland. And so I did a painting based on that. And then some of the people I met in Germany, like these two guys on the left side, that was Christian. And he was the caretaker. So he was a volunteer, and he was a caretaker of Fawad. Fawad at that point was 17, I want to say, Afghani who worked as a translator for the US troops, who was then injured in a roadside explosion. The Americans didn't want to care for him, so the Germans took him on and flew him out to Germany. And when he heard that I was living in the States, he was super excited, and he pulled out his cell phone, and he had all these images of US soldiers posing with him. They probably started using him when he was about 14, so pretty young. His English was obviously very good. But I thought, in addition to filming, and I have a scene in this first film, Refuge, where they appear. It's also a silent film, so there are no dialogues whatsoever. There were no interviews whatsoever. I also wanted to make a painting, and they're basically a little larger than life size, so it's a sizable painting. So there isn't dialogue between the paintings and the film, but I think that right now I'm going away from these figurative paintings, and I'm going more into abstract painting, so film is starting to do its own thing. One of the things that I have always been doing as an artist too is to always change it up, to not fall into a particular style. I don't like that idea, just because I think that, the outer conditions, circumstances should dictate to an extent how I'm going to go about making a film, making a painting. And so I have been doing, throughout the whole time, video pieces, so actually video art works. The most recent one is 5 minutes. And it's a completely different approach to it. And kind of like I work with a lot of found footage. So I'm not even that interested in creating more of my own footage. So I keep it just varied. But right now, so one of the things I'm working on is there's one project that is, again, connected to Vermont that I haven't started working on because I just sent in an application for some funding. So we'll see how that goes. But if it starts, it'll be based in Barrie, and it's a particular quarry in Barrie. It's Granite Industries. And I came across their story in a New York Times article. There were actually a couple of New York Times articles. Granite Industries in Barrie, they make all the headstones for Arlington National Cemetery. And I didn't know that. I mean, I was always wondering who's making these, and I thought it was several companies, but it's actually this one company in Barrie that has been family owned, is no longer family owned. It was bought by a Canadian company recently, but it's still the family in charge who's making it. And they have a lot of veterans who are working there, which, makes it fascinating, I think. And so I would like to do a shorter film, maybe around 40 minutes, about the making of one of these headstones, and then do a counterpiece where I meet with a family who has a fallen soldier in their family, and follow them in their daily routine leading up to them going to the cemetery and visiting the site or the headstone of their beloved one. So that is something that I wanted to do now for probably a couple of years. And I'm basically just waiting for some funding and the opportunity to get on that. And the other long-term project that will be a longer film, probably more around 80 minutes, is a family about my family in Poland. With exception of my parents who live in Germany, most of my family is still in Poland in one village where they have been living in since the end of World War II. So 1946 is when my grandfather moved there. My grandmother moved there in 1949. She's still alive, doing really well, loves the camera, it turns out, which has been so much fun to film with her. And so I'm doing a film that's a mix between documentary and I call it poetic intervention, because it's not reenactments. I'm not going to reenact scenes with actors that my grandmother is telling me about. I'm doing a kind of parallel story that runs alongside what she tells me about her past, and I'm using actors, usually amateurs, from the area, so from the village or from the surrounding villages, to kind of like do something with the material. And that's just started last year. There will be a trailer going up soon, but I think I will need probably another 2 years. But that's going to be the most film I have made, because I'm trying to, get away from the video aesthetic and actually make a film.